Welcome to Vitamin OC. I'm Joanna Weiss.
And I'm Whitney Gomez. Every week we bring you your recommended dose of civics and civilization in Orange County.
Today we're joined by Reverend Dr. Capetz, who is a pastor at Christ Church by the Sea in Newport Beach. We're so honored to have you with us. You were recommended by a dear friend of ours, Lisa Gaffney. She's been tracking the rise of Christian nationalism through her church, St. Mark's. She recommended this topic to us, so thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Just a little bit about you. You are a Southern California native, and you graduated from UCLA, then Yale Divinity School with a master's degree, and then the University of Chicago with your PhD.
That's correct.
You have played many different roles in the church, from parish minister to youth director, college chaplain, hospital chaplain, and you've been a seminary and college professor.
That's correct.
And you spent 3 decades living in Connecticut, Illinois, Virginia, Minnesota, Texas, and then returned home as a minister in the California Pacific Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you for joining us.
And you've also authored 3 books, co-authored 2, and edited several others. The books are called God, A Brief History, Christian Faith as Religion, and Recovering Protestantism's Original Insight. You're also you have podcasts on Substack. We found you on YouTube videos, and we read the 2 journal articles that you've published, as well as the one that you wrote for the Daily Pilot LA Times about a year ago. And that was talking about the history of religion within the United States and how that's impacting politics even today.
I think we've established you as an expert in the field and a student of what's going on currently. Let's talk a little bit about where you think things stand today. And then we want to get into the history of the United States and why current developments are so off track from what the founding fathers intended. So to start, can you please share with us the message that you communicated in your LA Times article?
Sure. I think that we're in a very serious crisis in the United States right now because of the rise to prominence of a movement that is called Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is an attempt at a synthesis between a particular political agenda and a particular kind of Christian religion that has the aim of making evangelical fundamentalist Christianity the official religion of the United States. As a Protestant Christian minister in the United Methodist Church and as a citizen of the United States, I find this deeply problematic for two reasons. One is religious and the other is political. Our nation was founded on the principle of guaranteeing religious freedom to all of our citizens, and thus the establishment of a particular form of religion as the official religion of the nation is a denial of that basic right to religious freedom. So, for example, in Newport Beach, where I work across the street from a Catholic church. Just to take that as an example, the fact that Catholics have the right to practice their religion in the United States without governmental interference is what protects my right to worship as a Methodist and not worry about governmental interference. The same can be said for the Jewish synagogue down the road, or the Lutheran church, or the Mormon church, or the Baha'i temple, the Buddhist temple, what have you. The religious freedom of any of us in America depends on the religious freedom of all. And so the idea of establishing a particular form of religion as the official religion of the United States is nothing short of an abrogation of the principle of religious liberty. That's so fundamentally anti-American that it shouldn't even have to be said. Your podcast is about instructing people in civics. Every American citizen who graduates from a public high school should know what the Constitution stands for and what the Bill of Rights is all about. And religious freedom is top of the list. What's even more troubling is that Christian nationalists are attempting to rewrite the history of the United States by arguing that our nation was founded to be an officially Christian nation. That's completely fallacious, and there's no evidence to support that. In fact, there's so much evidence to refute it that it's amazing that anyone could possibly believe such a thing. But not too long ago, I visited a mega church in our area that had its own bookstore and coffee shop, and it's a huge facility, but I was browsing the books that they're selling, and one of them was a book trying to argue precisely this point, that America was originally a Christian nation founded on biblical principles, but that we as a nation have strayed from that, and therefore all good Christians, so the argument goes, must, and all good Americans must want to see to it that America gets back to its roots and reestablishes a certain kind of Protestant Christianity as its official religion. So as an American citizen who grew up believing that one of the greatest things about the United States was the principle of religious liberty, I'm horrified. But as a Christian, for religious reasons, I find Christian nationalism to be abhorrent, because every time that Christianity has become wedded to political power, the religion itself has been corrupted. I mean, the people who founded our nation, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and company, they were so aware that the history of medieval Europe had been littered with slaughters of people, killing various kinds of Christians, killing each other over their various interpretations of Christian faith, or burning supposed heretics, people who disagreed with the church, burning them at the stake. I mean, they were so clear that this nation was supposed to move away from that, not only for the good of the body politic, but also for the good of religion itself. Religion has flourished in America, all kinds of religion, because religions have had freedom to be themselves, provided that they don't seek political power. They don't seek to use the government to oppose their own form of religion upon others. So as both a patriotic American and as a religious person, in my case, a Methodist Christian, I don't see how anyone could affirm religious nationalism as other than a political travesty that's going to destroy what made America great, as well as a religious travesty that's going to ruin the very religion it seeks to establish. It's going to corrupt it.
When you're talking about the founding fathers and what the original intent was, before we start talking about more modern history, if we can stay in that period for a minute, can you review with us the thesis in your article, Is America a Christian Nation? Part 1, American Origins? And I think people forget to distinguish between the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and our founders.
Okay, so the first Europeans who made their way to what became New England, the Pilgrims, and then following that, the Puritans. These were people who did intend to found their new society on Christian principles. There's no doubt about that. They did not come to America to create a pluralistic society where religious groups that differed from their own would have religious freedom. The most one can say that they left England behind, where they didn't have religious freedom to practice their version of Christianity according to their own interpretation of the Bible. They left all that behind to come to a place where they could have freedom for themselves, but they had no intention of extending it to any other group of Christians who disagreed with them. So, but in that sense, you could say that the Pilgrims and later the Puritans intended to have their societies in New England based on their interpretation of the Bible with their brand of Christianity officially established and protected by government. But the New England experiment failed for the same reason that it had failed in Old England. Because, what do you do if you have people in your society who disagree about something religiously? Well, you have to either exile those persons or you have to execute them. And that's why eventually people like Roger Williams, who founded the colony of Rhode Island, advocated that there should be a distinction and thus a separation between one's civic duties and one's religious duties. But that went against the grain of the original model of Puritan Massachusetts that he was forced to leave. So by the time that the founding fathers of our United States of America wrote the documents on which our nation is based, they had imbibed a different understanding than the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And their understanding came not from the Bible, but from the Enlightenment, that movement within Western civilization that began in the middle of the 17th century and came to full flower in the 18th century. And the Enlightenment argued that human society should not be based upon any religious principle, but solely on rational principles that are accessible to all people who are willing to use their reason fully. And so our nation, the United States, as distinct from whatever the Pilgrims and Puritans were trying to do, our nation, that was born July 4th, 1776, is decidedly not an explicitly Christian nation. That's what it means to have the disestablishment clause in the Constitution. Government shall make no law respecting an institution of religion or interfering with the free practice thereof. And that's why what the Christian nationalists are teaching about the historical origins of our nation is a vicious lie. And what's dangerous is that so many people believe it. And unfortunately, the movement of homeschooling children has aided and abetted this, because if you homeschool your children and you don't educate them in a public school like I went to, where are they going to learn civics? Where are they going to learn the truth about American history if the parents disagree with that, right? Parents who homeschool their children are free to teach them anything they want. So this has been a very dangerous, it's been long in the making for at least 40 years, and it's now coming to haunt us.
I want to just refine one point that I took note of in reading your journal articles, and that is you view the United States as culturally Christian, because we historically have been majority Christian.
Right. The majority of citizens historically have been Christians. They still are. But that's a statement of fact, not a statement of principle.
So we can be culturally Christian, which is separate and distinct from having a top-down official religion. And the fact
we have been.
And the fact that we don't have a top-down official government sanctioned religion has made it possible for all the religions that you mentioned to thrive. And that's a very important distinction.
It's an absolutely crucial distinction.
Okay.
Yeah. It's what enabled the Jews to come here in great numbers. When the Jews had been terribly persecuted throughout the history of Christianity in Europe, ever since Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire at the end of the 4th century. And when the United States was founded according to the principle that there's not going to be an established religion in America, the Jews left Europe in record number to come here, because this was the first nation in the history of Western civilization not to make being a Christian a requirement of citizenship. So just ask your Jewish friends and neighbors what they think of this idea that the United States was based on biblical principles. The Christians who say that are not saying it was based on Jewish principles. They're saying it was based on Christian principles, which by definition eventually leads to the exclusion of Jews.
What were the founding fathers' principles on that? If we go to James Madison and George Washington, you were saying how their points of view supported this idea that we need to remain secular.
Well, James Madison is an interesting figure because he explicitly argued against the idea that America should declare Christianity as the national religion. And what he was specifically opposing was the idea that even if we don't have a national church, see, if we don't say that the Methodist Church or the Baptist Church or the Presbyterian Church is the official church of America, we should still say that Christianity in general is the official religion. And Madison quite clearly saw that for what it was, that's just a roundabout way of having an official church, because eventually someone will say that your church does not correspond with Christianity as defined in the Constitution. He saw that was a less than honest proposal, because it in effect would establish one particular sect or denomination of Christianity over against all the rest eventually, even if that was not the intention. He understood that if you want to preclude the possibility of being persecuted for religious reasons by the government, you could never declare any particular religion. So Madison's position won the day. Now, Thomas Jefferson originally wrote Virginia's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, which was adopted by the state of Virginia in 1786. You see, even after the founding of the United States in 1776, a number of states still had their own official churches. And so it wasn't until the first quarter of the 19th century that all the states had eventually abolished the requirement that one of the churches be the official church of that particular state. So Jefferson had written this declaration for establishing religious freedom originally for the state of Virginia, which is where he was from, but it eventually became the pattern for all of the states. And Jefferson makes a very interesting point. He says that belief in general, whether religious belief or scientific belief, can never be coerced by government. A person can only be persuaded to adopt a particular belief because that person believes that that belief is true, given the evidence or the arguments in favor of it. And so he said that a government which enshrines a particular religious belief as a condition of citizenship would make hypocrites out of all of us, because if the only choice that we have is to be burned at the stake or exiled, who of us wouldn't lie and say, yeah, that's what I believe in order to, keep my livelihood and my home and my life. So I mean, the very nature of belief, Jefferson said, cannot be coerced. So the idea of having an official religion is a contradiction in terms. That's a brilliant argument.
Sure is.
Well, this is one of the things that I think rattles me so that the current political climate is ignoring so much of history. And that we had some state established religions and churches nearly 250 years ago.
Right.
And then the founding fathers decided that wasn't the best route for our country, so they disbanded them.
Right.
So we've been here before. This has been addressed. And this was addressed by the founders.
We were here before with the Puritans and the Pilgrims. And Anne Hutchinson, who's a notable figure in early American religious history, was a Puritan woman in Massachusetts. And she dared to assert that the Holy Spirit could speak to individuals apart from the mediation of the officially ordained ministers. Now, that was seen as a heretical and seditious thing to say back then, and she had to run for her life to Rhode Island, which fortunately, due to Roger Williams' influence, provided a safe haven for people like that. But how many people in America today wouldn't agree with Anne Hutchinson and said, yeah, God speaks directly to me. I don't need to wait for the minister or the priest to tell God what I need to hear. You see what I mean? In other words, the beliefs of supposed heretics in the people who were declared heretics in the past later becomes orthodoxy or common opinion for many of us centuries down the road.
So the religious right political movement in the United States seemed to have picked up after Roe v. Wade in 73, picked up some steam with Reagan. You mentioned homeschooling as a development. How are you seeing that development over the past 40, 50 years?
Well, there's been a wonderful new movie that's just been made. I don't know if you know Robin Voss. Okay, Robin, she goes to St. Mark's Presbyterian Church as well. And she's the executive producer of this excellent film. And it's about how the religious right came to identify reproductive choice as their bête noire. And the movie documents very well that what happened is that when segregation was outlawed in the southern states and private schools and universities, if they wanted to continue to receive federal funds from the government, could not any longer practice segregation. So you couldn't have all white colleges or all white private schools. That was seen by white evangelicals and fundamentalists in the South as a great setback for their cause. And so what they decided to do was to focus on a different issue. They felt that they had lost the battle in the civil rights fight for segregation, and they focused on abortion. And what's ironic is that many people in the evangelical world or in the Republican Party, such as Ronald Reagan or Billy Graham, had at one time, at an earlier time, actually defended abortion as in keeping with the American sense of an individual's freedom from governmental interference with their lives. But that all changed once certain leaders of the religious right, such as Jerry Falwell, decided that this is the movement that we'll seize upon and will present reproductive choice as a threat to the American way of life, the Christian understanding of marriage and family. And
Robin screened it for WAVE maybe 3 or 4 months ago. He had told me about the project years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and it was really well researched, and the amount of time that they spent arguing this case where abortion becomes a proxy for race in the South.
Let me just say a word about George Washington, because you asked me about him a minute ago. In the article that you're referring to, I cite George Washington, who writes to assure certain people that he never would have supported a constitutional right to religious freedom if he had believed that in any way it would lead to the infringement of religious freedom upon any particular group. And what Washington says is that in exchange for that religious freedom, what the government or the society expects of its citizens, regardless of which religious persuasion is theirs, is good citizenship. That is, you support a society that guarantees religious protection to all, because that's the same right that guarantees your own religious protection. And this is important because I've heard some Christians on the right wing, and these people are usually evangelical Protestants who have a fundamentalist theology. I've heard some of these people tell me that Christians in America are persecuted. Now, I'm almost 70 years old, and I've been a Christian all my life. As you know, I was ordained to the ministry 34 years ago today, as a matter of fact.
Congratulations.
And I have never seen any evidence of Christians being persecuted in the United States for being Christians. So, in defense of Washington's point, that needs to be lifted up, because what these people are really saying is that the government will not allow me or us to make our point of view the government's official point of view. So let me give you an example. I was once giving a public lecture in Minnesota on this question of, is America a Christian nation? And there was a group of people from a particular church in the audience who afterwards gave me as an illustration of their persecution in our country the fact that the local school board, the public school board, had refused to adopt an explicitly Christian textbook as the textbook for children attending public school. And they thought this was an obvious example of persecution. I was astonished. And I said to them, well, let me ask you this. What if your local school board adopted an explicitly Muslim textbook? How would you? No, they didn't even understand why what they were saying was ludicrous. You see what I mean? It was self-evident to them that the government should support their religion, but not somebody else's. It's no different than when people in the southern states who resisted desegregation felt that the government was infringing on their rights if they owned a restaurant, and now they would have to let white people sit next to black people at the lunch counters. And that's why your podcast on civics and civilization is so important, because people not only don't know American history in our country, they don't know the basic lessons of civics either. I knew this stuff backwards and forwards after graduating from a public school when I was 18 years old. How come people don't know it anymore? We've got more media technology and less knowledge than at any time in our nation's history. It's frightening.
Well, one of the themes that you've talked about is that being an American is oftentimes in this day and age being conflated with being a Christian,
Right.
and that they're synonymous to some people. Can you talk a little bit about how that's impacting politics today?
Well, just look at the Republican Party. I grew up in a Republican family, a conservative Republican family, but there was no expectation that the Republican Party would support any sort of policies that would infringe upon the principle of religious liberty. I mean, it was inconceivable. Moreover, you have an anomalous situation in the Republican Party now because it's no longer constituted by a group of people who profess allegiance to certain political principles. It's allegiance to a man, Donald Trump. And, although I'm not a Republican anymore, I have to, take off my hat to conservative Republicans like Liz Cheney or her father or Adam Kinzinger or others who feel like the conservative principles of the Republican Party have been betrayed by Trumpism. And I think that's absolutely right. And furthermore, I think a large part of this betrayal of conservative principles that used to identify what the Republican Party stood for is this transaction that Trump has negotiated with his voters who make up the religious right. In exchange for their votes, he will give them what they want, namely justices on the Supreme Court and elsewhere who will overturn the legislation that these Christians are opposed to because it violates their idea of what a Christian nation should be. So they've already succeeded in overturning Roe versus Wade. The first time in the history of our nation where what had once been a guaranteed right is overturned so that women no longer have that protection in the law anymore. And of course, the next thing they're coming for is same-sex marriage. And who knows what else they'll go for. There's no stopping them. I mean, if this is allowed to continue, personally, Trump doesn't have any vested personal interest in Christianity. It's a purely transactional thing. And these people, though, on the religious right, have made a devil's bargain. By supporting Trump, they in turn expect to get from him everything behind door number 3.
Along those lines, at one point in your journal article, you argue that Christian fundamentalism, which we obviously see taking hold today, and Muslim fundamentalism, which we saw play out on 9/11, are hand in hand and very, very similar.
They're different in content because Islam and Christianity are different in some respects, of course, not all. But the phenomenon of fundamentalism is the same. Any fundamentalism not only asserts that our religion is the only true religion, so in this case, Christianity is the only true religion, not Islam, Judaism, etc. Or in the Muslim case, Islam is the only true religion, not Judaism, Christianity, etc. But our interpretation of the one true religion is the only true interpretation. When I meet Christian fundamentalists and they find out that I'm not a fundamentalist and I'm not a member of one of their denominations, they don't even consider me to be a real Christian. I've met many Muslims who are not fundamentalists and are as disturbed as we've been by the actions of people who are fundamentalist Muslims and worry about what might happen to their societies if the fundamentalists become dominant. The phenomenon is the same. The religions differ, but the mentality is identical. And the other thing about fundamentalism is that in many ways, it's a reaction against modernity, against all of the things that was brought about by the Enlightenment, including the separation of church and state, the rights to the individual to choose her or his own path in life. In a traditional religion, which is what fundamentalism tries to reassert in the face of modernity, in a traditional religion, individuals don't have those kind of freedoms to carve their own path in life because the Holy Scripture or the tradition dictates in advance what individuals are supposed to do and be.
There are a couple of words that you think have been badly misinterpreted. And so I'm just going to read them off and let's talk about them. The first word is secular. The second word is humanism. And then also liberal. Can you talk about those 3 words?
Well, these 3 words have become words that refer to bad, evil things in the minds of people on the religious right. So, or even just the political right. So liberal, for instance, anyone who is a liberal is whatever that means. is a terrible person. Well, that fails to notice that the word liberal historically has meant many different things. And the conservative economic policies of someone like Ronald Reagan would historically have been seen as liberal in the sense of Adam Smith and laissez-faire capitalism. The word liberal just means free. It comes from a Latin word liber, meaning free. And liberal in the sense that I use the term is twofold. One is, as when we speak of the liberal arts. When I went to college, the ideal was to get a liberal arts education, which meant that one would become a well-rounded person so that one would have the training requisite for a responsible, free citizen in a democracy. So a liberal arts education in that sense was supposed to prepare one for being a good citizenship, regardless of whether one was a doctor, a lawyer, a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker, right? So, that sense of liberal needs to be defended and lifted up. But I don't believe that people on the religious right truly believe in a liberal arts education, because one of the effects of a good liberal arts education is to expand one's mind, to make one appreciate people and cultures and religions that are different from one's own. And of course, if you're a fundamentalist and you believe that all people should live and believe as you live and believe, then a liberal arts education would be at cross purposes, right? But there's another sense of liberal, and that is when I speak of liberal religion or theology. I would call myself a liberal Protestant Christian. And what that means, it's related to liberal arts, but it has a somewhat distinct meaning in religion and theology. A liberal Christian is someone who believes that being a Christian need not be pitted against what it means to be a modern person, as defined by the Enlightenment. So I think that the Enlightenment, and I've spoken of that before, the movement that came to fruition in the 18th century and gave us our distinctively American form of government, issued in three major challenges to the medieval mindset. The first is scientific. The Enlightenment gave us modern science, which taught us what causes disease or how to cure disease. It enabled us to create technology that would allow me to fly to Dallas and back last week or send men to the moon and back. Science and its resultant technology is what makes this podcast possible. This is one of the greatest achievements that the human mind has ever attained. So science has taught us to look upon the natural world very differently than ancient and modern people ever could have imagined. I think that those insights need to be incorporated into modern forms of religiosity so that Christians aren't battling scientists. Things about fundamentalist religion is that they see a threat in modern scientific understandings of nature. Whether you're talking about how the Earth came and our galaxy and universe came into being, well, according to them, it has to have happened in 6 24-hour days because that's what the opening pages of Genesis say, right? Or the human species cannot possibly have evolved from other pre-human species, as Charles Darwin taught and as is accepted by all serious biologists, because that eradicates the idea that human beings were made in the image of God, as the Bible teaches. Well, I think all of that is nonsense. When I was in college, I had to take a couple of courses in science to be a broadly educated human being, right? And there was a great course called Evolution for Non-Science Majors. And I thought, oh, great. Well, this won't be too much over my head. And it wasn't, but it was taught by a biologist who explained how did Darwin come to these ideas. Now, the interesting thing about this is that whenever I went to this class, you'd have to walk through a crowd of fundamentalist evangelical students holding signs protesting the teaching of this class because it was satanic and anti-Christian. So the professor was really surprised that I identified as a Christian and that I told him I was going into the ministry, that I wasn't upset by anything he was teaching. He had never met a Christian who didn't have any problems with what he was teaching. So that's one thing that I mean by a liberal Protestant. I do not hold to a literal understanding of what Genesis says. Genesis is not a book of science. It's a book of religion. And ancient people cannot have been expected to know or understand what modern people know and understand. The second thing is the second contribution of the Enlightenment to modern religion and theology is historical. As a result of the Enlightenment, we have a set of tools for studying the Bible that we call the historical critical method. As a result of that kind of study, we know all sorts of things about the history of ancient Israel and early Christianity that were unknown to Christians and Jews throughout the ancient and modern periods. Now, much of this information and knowledge is threatening to fundamentalists and other conservative religious people because it undermines certain historical claims that these people have thought were essential to their religious faith. So, for example, traditionally Jews and Christians have believed that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, called Pentateuch, were written by Moses. No modern biblical scholar would claim that anymore. In fact, in 6th grade Sunday school, I was taught that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. You see, I don't find that threatening, but one Orthodox Jew once said to me, if I could no longer believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, I couldn't be a Jew anymore. But, there's liberal forms of Judaism where, that's just not an issue. And then finally, the third challenge of the Enlightenment is ethical and political. Our nation was fought against the British monarchy. That's how we came into existence. And monarchs in Europe defended what was called the divine right of kings, that God had ordained rule by monarchy so that it's not only taught by Scripture, but it's written into the very texture of nature, that this is how human society should be ruled. And because the founding fathers of our nation decided we're going to use reason to determine how a society should be designed and not base ourselves on blind allegiance to what's been handed down to us by tradition, we're going to call into question ideas that don't make sense to us anymore. So, for example, liberal Protestants were engaged in the movement for abolition of slavery in this country, even though there are many passages in the Bible that teach slaves should obey their masters. You see what I mean? So these are the elements of modernity that I would defend tooth and nail. And I couldn't be a Christian if I couldn't be a liberal Christian, because I can't give up these aspects of modernity that are just as important to me as the things I've received from the Christian tradition. I believe in modern science. I've benefited from it. Every time I go to the dentist, I'm grateful that I'm a modern person and not a medieval person. I'm grateful for the historical knowledge that we have about the Bible and all the other religions of the world. And I'm grateful that we live in a society that taught me to think for myself about ethics and politics. Just think, over 100 years ago, women in this country first got the right to vote. Isn't that astonishing? But we wouldn't have any of this had it not been for modernity and the Enlightenment. And that's what the word liberal signifies in a religious or theological context, is that you welcome these contributions of the Enlightenment as gifts of God, no less than the Bible.
One of the phenomenon that's happening these days is people not believing that they can believe in science and also hold their religious beliefs, that they are
right. Incompatible.
Do you have any suggestions for how we as a country can move forward?
The thing I think that we most need is more education about religion at a much more sophisticated level. In other words, the answer to this is not to talk less about religion, but to talk more about it, and to bring theological, historical, and philosophical sophistication to bear on its interpretation. So I actually believe that it should be a required part of public education in America to study religion, not just Christianity, all the religions. If we had an educated populace, citizenry, that understood a lot about religion and could appreciate what is good about all the religions, then I don't think we'd have so many problems as we do. So I think education, there's no evading education if you want to be a responsible citizen.
I imagine that you were as surprised as the rest of us when the religious right capitulated and got on board with Donald Trump.
I think I was more surprised that our country voted for Trump to begin with. Maybe I thought there was some more religious and moral integrity in among evangelicals than they've shown. I had lunch recently with a professor who teaches at Fuller Seminary, which is an evangelical seminary. He said to me that he thinks the real question now is whether evangelicals are still Christians. That's a pointed way of making the point, isn't it?
Wow.
Yeah. And he teaches at an evangelical seminary.
Oh, wow.
I mean, what I mean by that is that, long before Donald Trump, my opposition to Donald Trump is not a matter of policy, though I also disagree with his policies. Long before Donald Trump gave any indication of an interest to go into politics, he was already very popular as a TV reality show host. And I saw right through him back then. I preached a sermon against Donald Trump when he was at the height of his popularity with that show, The Apprentice. And I was appalled that that show was so popular and that so many people were dying to get on that show in the hopes of becoming the next Donald Trump. I was appalled because of what it said those people valued, that Donald Trump is the ideal of a successful person. And so in the sermon, I said, you don't want your children to become, I was talking to a group of Christians, you don't want your children to grow up and become like Donald Trump. This is an immoral human being who cares only about wealth and is driven by greed and selfishness. It has nothing to do with politics, right? So I was astonished when he became the nominee of the Republican. There are many good Republicans in the world. In my lifetime, Gerald Ford, John McCain, Bob Dole, most recently Mitt Romney, who showed a lot of courage and spine in opposing Trump. I was astonished that he became the nominee of the Republican Party for president, and then that the Republicans voted for him. And then I was doubly shocked when after the first term and what happened on January 6th, that he could win this time by the popular vote. I mean, that says to me there's something so morally and spiritually bankrupt about our citizenry and how any Christian with any moral and spiritual integrity could support that man. I mean, that's why I say they made a bargain with the devil.
You've talked about how you think education is one of the ways that we get back from here, that we need to teach more civics and civilization to our students. And one of the ways that we can do that, I guess, with our older generation is to start having conversations with our religious friends and try to find that common ground. Would you have any suggestions for how we can try to find that common ground with our friends and begin discussing religion?
Well, let's just say that we were sitting with a group of people who believed this fiction that the founding fathers of our nation intended this to be an officially Christian nation. Let's just read the documents, the original sources. They're there. All can read them. Let's sit down with them. Let's put aside all interpretations of them that you find in books, whether of the left or the right. Just read the founding documents like I've cited them in this journal article. I mean, that's the only way forward, right? I mean, you can't read what Jefferson, Madison, and Washington wrote and conclude that they intended for Christianity to be the official religion of this nation. How can you? The conversation, in the sense of wanting to get at the truth, presupposes a commitment to rationality. Not all people have that commitment. So when I was at Yale Divinity School, I went and visited my aunt in Illinois for the Thanksgiving holiday, and she was attending a conservative Baptist church at the time. We went to someone's house for Thanksgiving, and when someone learned that I was a student at Yale Divinity School, he came up to me, a total stranger, and he came up to me with this kind of real macho posture, and he said, if I went to Yale Divinity School, those professors couldn't teach me anything. And I thought to myself, you're right about that. I mean, there are people who don't want to be teachable. I always find it great when somebody corrects me, because then I'm closer to the truth than I was. People have to decide, am I a person who's committed to reason and rationality? Which is to say, am I a person who's committed to the truth? Am I willing to risk my present understanding of truth by learning from others? Whether that's the truth of science, the truth of the Bible, the truth of ethics and politics, the truth of our nation's history,
Wow. Sounds like we have a lot of work to do.
Well, we do as a nation if we want to save our nation.
Yeah. Pastor Paul, thank you for joining us. We can't thank you enough for sharing your articles and all of your expertise.
I'm happy to come back anytime.
We really appreciate that.
We do so appreciate it. You're such a great resource for our community
thank you.
here and
Thank
such a calm voice of reason.
I hope
Thank you
so.
for spending
Thank you
some
so
time with
much.
us.
Thank you so
And
much.
to our listeners, thank you for joining us for your recommended dose of civics and civilization in Orange County.
We'll see you next time on Vitamin OC.